Hi, everyone. My name is Cree Miles, and I'll be your moderator this evening. And I'm extremely excited and grateful that you all are here. But before we officially start this discussion, we're going to kick it off with some music by my very talented sister friend, SistaStrings. Yeah, they deserve a round of applause for sure. I actually don't need this. Okay. SistaStrings has performed with Malik Yusuf, opened for Black Violin, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Lupe Fiasco, BJ the Chicago Kid, and The Roots. Outside of playing music venues, SistaStrings goes into schools and conducts assemblies, encouraging young people to pursue the arts and to not be afraid of hard work. Outreach and representation are important to these two young ladies as African American string players. The ladies are advocates for diversity in the arts and promote social justice in all that they do musically. SistaStrings' debut EP entitled Lift is out now on all musical platforms. Please join me in welcoming SistaStrings.
For you all before, shit gets real.
Thank you so much. And now an energy cleanse by founder and executive director of DNS Healing, Tracy Tracy. Come on up.
Right next to you? No, next to them. Oh, yeah.
And all of you stand up and join hands. Because these are our moderators for this evening, our speakers, and we want them to be able to stay connected through this whole thing. Hold hands in circle. Yeah. Okay, thank you, sisters. Thank you. I don't know about y'all, but that put me in a place, right? Right? Okay, so I want you to stay in that place. Close your eyes. And just stay in that very safe space as that gift and music just gives us. And take some deep cleansing breaths and breathe from your belly. And as you inhale, I want you to expand your abdomen. And exhale, just slide it through. And allow that beautiful music that just fills up all your cells to just penetrate all of your body. You just stay in that space of love and openness. And the four of you, I want you to connect with each other in the heart center as well as your audience. Who you're focusing to this heart area. And just allow a beautiful light to flow through your body. Continue to take deep breaths and allow that energy just to spread out as far as you can. You can let it settle, let it take over the room, completely stop. And just allow that love energy and openness to become all. Just join here with these breaths. Inhale, expand your abdomen. Exhale and unite your heart. And let one thought focus around one intention that you want to get from this evening's talk, and hold that sacred energy throughout your time. And just slowly and gently bring yourself back to the room. Inhale and exhale.
Thank you, TT. That's my godmother. And thank you to SistaStrings for opening us up. Yeah. Hello again. As I said, my name is Cree Miles, and I am the moderator of this 1619 community discussion. I will not say anything further without first acknowledging those who were removed or erased from their homeland here where we are gathering, including the Menominee, Miami, Sioux, Peoria, Potawatomi, and the nations of names we will never even know. We are currently gathering on stolen land. I delved into 1619 on my way to a wedding in Minneapolis this August. It was merely supposed to be information for me to absorb in order to pass time, but as Nicole Hannah-Jones unfolded contravention after transgression after injustice, I realized that I wasn't just passively learning facts that casually spoke to my experience as a Black woman. I was getting language and receipts for invisible racial riptides I had been experiencing my entire life. I knew that there had to be a conversation about it, and I'm a Black woman, so I said, fuck it, I'll do it. I sat for a very long time trying to figure out how I was going to open up this event. I thought about all of my earliest memories as a child, especially as they relate to my race, and I've been trying to figure out how I would explain them to you and get you to understand the impact that they had on me. How can I explain to you all the memory of being called black at 4, when the fact by itself doesn't elicit any immediate type of emotion until maybe you learn that the black was hulked at me, much like one would do a loogie? How can I get you to understand the embarrassment of embarrassing your first grade teacher, who was merely trying to tidy up everyone's hair right before they took their school picture, but looked at your hair and looked at the minuscule fine-tooth comb in their hand and knew that there was absolutely no way it would make it through your beautiful naps, but certainly didn't have an alternative comb for the only black girl in the class, so instead with a red face daintily patted you on the head and continued to the classmate behind you? How do I get you to understand the uncontainable pride I felt sitting on the carpet front and center in 2nd grade as my teacher read through a picture book about MLK Day, about Martin Luther King Jr. on MLK Day? How do I explain the demigod status of my great-grandfather occupied in my mind after my grandmother told me about him sitting on the porch of his 4-room shack in Kosciuszko, Mississippi with a gun on his lap every Saturday night, just in case those boys in the robes decided to pull up? How can I explain to you the weight of the knowledge that I have blood coursing through my veins of 2 humans named Horace and Fanny who were enslaved their entire lives? I can't. I can't explain to you how all of those things have shaped me into the person that I am standing before you right now. I can't convince you that black in America is a deeply unique experience that is equal parts trauma and healing and pride and dysfunction. I can't get you to understand anything that you aren't ready to embrace. So with that being said, given the depth and breadth of this conversation, I want to make it clear that we are starting with the working knowledge and acceptance that the United States of America was built on the backs of African slaves, and that the very specific and insidious type of racism used to justify our brutal and unique system of slavery is still very present in forming every institution in this country still today. Given that racism functions as a system and not as isolated moments of hate, it is crucial that as we engage in this conversation, white people are willing to examine how they have contributed, especially passively, to black people's oppression. My sincerest hope is that post this event, everyone will be braver. Okay, let's meet the panelists. Yeah, you guys come on up. Oh, and there's mics, great. Okay, I'm gonna let them sit first. Okay, I'll start with Nat. Nat Godley is a professor of history at Alverno College. He was my professor of history at Alverno College. When I asked him to be on this panel, he in fact told me that he was not an expert and pointed me in several different directions away from him. But, as I just said, my hope for all of you this evening is that you will leave braver, and I don't think I know anyone who uses their positions of power and their voice to advocate for truth and equity louder or more consistently than Nat. His areas of expertise include colonialism, minorities and citizenship, and he is currently working on a book about Algeria's Jewish population during the colonial period. Everyone welcome Nat Godley. Next, I have Dr. Amber Tucker. Dr. Amber Tucker has experience designing and conducting original empirical research using qualitative methodologies. She uses theories and principles of adult learning and identity to develop identity development to examine issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity, and provide practical implications for intersectional practices. As the assistant director of the UW-Milwaukee's Women's Resource Center, her job responsibilities entail administering educational and development programs, serving as the first responder to incidences of sexual and interpersonal violences, staff supervision and assessment, and evaluation of the center's program and services. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Tucker. Yes.
Oh, you forgot my current position. That was a previous one.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I don't have it.
Oh, I know. I emailed it to you. It was late. I was grading papers. I'm so
Oh
sorry.
no, it's I'm sorry.
I'll just
I'm
fill
so,
it
yeah,
out.
you do it.
That sounded really good. Did I write that?
Yes.
Okay. So that was part of my previous work. So currently, I am an assistant professor of sociology at Cardinal Stritch University, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Sociology at Cardinal Stritch University.
Thank you. Okay. Next, we have Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson is an award-winning journalist, a graduate of Concordia University, and head griot docent of America's Black Holocaust Museum. 2015 winner of the Eliminating Racism Award from Southeast Wisconsin's YWCA and 2016 Courageous Love Award from the First Unitarian Society. He is the 2017 winner of the Frank P. Zeidler Public Service Award from the City of Milwaukee. He won the first ever Micah Legacy Award in 2018. In August of 2016, he accepted a position of Community Relations Writer for the Milwaukee Independent. He was invited to be a contributing writer for the Huffington Post in October 2017. His column at the Milwaukee Independent won the 2017 Silver Award for Best Online Column and 2018 Gold Award for Best Online Column, and the Silver Award for Best Written Column from the Milwaukee Press Club. Reggie has served as a race relations expert for CNN, Wisconsin Public Radio, National Public Radio, Reuters News Service, the BBC, and several statewide channels. Everyone, please welcome Reggie Jackson. How are you guys?
I'm great.
Fantastic. I'm excited to be here.
Definitely excited, still a little nervous.
Fair. Okay. So my first question for the three of you is, the concept of a country's founding being attached to when the first group of enslaved people stepped foot on the soil is extremely radical. Why is it necessary?
Well, I think, as we think about our nation's history and what we typically learn in school about it, that's not part of what we learn, is that experience that the enslavement of African people as well as Native Americans was a legal institution for 246 years of our nation's history, which is about 60% of our nation's history, going back to the days before we were even a formal nation. And so if we had learned that in school the way we were supposed to, I think that we would be able to kind of contextualize why we have the problems in society we have related to race. But because so many of us have not learned that history, we still struggle to have productive conversations about race. Because when we have conversations about race, they're typically not productive because people don't know what they're talking about. So we should do something to force our educational institutions to make us learn these things. I did a workshop for some teachers in Wauwatosa recently who are trying to develop some more inclusive curriculum. And what I did was I showed them what's in the Department of Public Instruction state standards on social studies about certain topics. So one of the topics I looked up in the standards was slavery. And it literally says the first time you talk about slavery is 1800. You literally miss almost 200 years of it, according to the state standards. And so I can't blame people for not knowing, but I can blame people for not advocating that we all know.
I think it's also important because going back to education, it shifts the narrative. I'm a parent and I also attended public schools, but, for my daughter, she had learned outside of the classroom that the Black experience, African American experience, did not start with slavery, and I think that's a misconception. When kids pick up history books or they attend school, that when they start talking about the Black experience here in the States, it begins with slavery, and then we have this brief period of oppression, and then there was a march in Martin Luther King, civil rights, and then Barack Obama. That's Black history. That's history. That's what kids learn about history of Black folks, and some, key inventors and whatnot. But I think it shifts the narrative when talking about the Black experience. And then I also think that I think that it shifts the power dial when we start talking about the Black experience as not starting from a place of oppression. When we say that the Black experience is connected to the foundation of this country, it means that, it wasn't this passive acceptance of oppression and injustice here, and that Black people actually contributed beyond, you know, the inventions that Black people are just now getting credit for, that we're not talking about just patents and inventions, we're also talking about the construction of this country, and I think that's really important.
So, as Cree said, my first response to her was that I'm not an expert in this. But I'm going to actually bring in some of my actual expertise. My research is on national identity in the French context, in colonialism. And as such, there's a major French thinker, Ernest Renan, on national identity, and he says the very essence of a nation is that all of its members have many things in common, and also that everyone has forgotten many things. And I think that really applies here in the transformation that you're talking about, in the radical step that we're trying to push ourselves to take. The U.S., as any nation does, created very pleasant myths about itself from its founding, supposedly democratic founding. We're familiar with those, obviously. But in so doing, it deliberately forgot the central role of enslavement and genocide. But now we're in a place where the U.S. some of the U.S. is trying to change that. The members, the acknowledged, recognized, given dignity members of the U.S. has changed. We are, not me actually, because I'm not American, but another way in which I felt somewhat shaky on my qualifications. But the U.S. is acknowledging that the peoples that had previously pushed aside and said, no, they're not fully Americans, even they're not fully human, is acknowledging that, yes, now they are part of the nation. And so since that membership has changed, we also need to change the story. The problem is that those heroic founding narratives are really dear to a lot of white people's hearts. And but I think what we need to get to is some recognition that while America was founded in democratic ideas that do have incredible liberatory potential, it's also founded in some of the most violently repressive practices in human history. Yeah. And we've got to find a middle ground, a way to connect those. So.
I hate founded too, because this land wasn't found. It already existed. There were people already here. People from the continent of Africa had already been throughout the Americas. Indigenous folks here too. So I guess if I use that, that's not what I meant. I meant people that were here, not founding this country as it is. I think that's really important. I was talking to my students about this the other day, about the panel and all of that, and the question that you asked about, you know, the idea that the history of this country started with the first kidnapped Africans stepping foot on this soil. And, you know, we were talking about, well, why? Why do we have to go to college to learn different things? Why do we have to read outside textbooks to hear the real story? And I said, well, history is never written by the losers. It's always written by the winners. And in this case, it's the colonizers. And so what you have is colonial history, but we call it American history in K through 12 education.
There's an African proverb that says the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until a lion is able to tell its tale.
Amen. Yeah. I would love to delve down into the vegan hole if you guys want to do it, because I'm just kidding. Okay. 1619 does a beautiful job of breaking down a myriad of whys as they relate to our country's founding. Some examples include why our specific form of capitalism is so brutal, why we don't have universal health care, why we do have an extremely comprehensive public education system, doing a beautiful job of always connecting it back to racism and Black people's commitment to liberty and justice for all. As we sit here, though, in the most segregated city in America, with Black infant mortality rates that rival third world countries and with Black students having the second lowest graduation rate in the country, I'm wondering if you all can speak to any whys specific to Wisconsin and Milwaukee. How are we worse than states that held slaves in the first place?
I was born in Mississippi,
Amen.
1965. And I went to school all the way through second grade in Mississippi, moved to Milwaukee in third grade, right before I started third grade. Right before I started school in Mississippi, the schools in my hometown had been integrated by a court order. A federal judge basically told them, do it or else, right? Wasn't like they wanted to do it. And this was many years after Brown versus Board of Education. So anyway, moved to Milwaukee and lived on 18th in Meineke for 2 years, and then moved to 14th and Ring. 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, every school I went to in Milwaukee was all black. I didn't have white classmates until I caught the Route 80 bus all the way to the south side and went to Milwaukee Tech. So when people ask me where I'm from, I often say I'm from Mississippi. Because in many ways, Wisconsin likes to, and the Midwest in general, likes to tell people how friendly the Midwest is. Right. But what we don't learn is that when blacks started to come to Milwaukee in significant numbers in the 1940s, primarily as a result of the need for labor during World War II, in 1940, there were only 8,800 black people in Milwaukee. That grew to 21,000 by 1950, 62,000 by 1960, 105,000 by 1970, so on and so forth. So as blacks moved to Milwaukee and moved to Wisconsin, white people weren't happy about it. They resisted having black people live in their neighborhoods. They resisted giving black people access to quality education. So when we talk about how bad the South is, those of us who live in the North love to point fingers at Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Florida, and so on and so forth, as if there's innocence in the North. We didn't have Jim Crow signs in Milwaukee, but we had Jim Crow policies. We had Jim Crow mindsets. We had racial restrictive covenants that were used to keep black people out of neighborhoods. We had a law passed in 1955 called the Oak Creek Law, which basically allowed small communities around Milwaukee to incorporate so they couldn't be annexed by the city of Milwaukee, because they felt if they were annexed by the city of Milwaukee, that the city of Milwaukee would eventually put public housing in those suburban communities, which meant, in the minds of white people, black people housing. So there was always resistance in the North in a variety of different forms. Milwaukee Public Schools said that the Brown decision didn't apply to Milwaukee Public Schools, as there was no written policy that black children and white children had to be separate. So what they had instead was they had a policy called intact busing. And what it was is, as the black student population grew, they should have built schools where the black people were living, on the north side of the city of Milwaukee. What they did instead was they built schools on the south side, which is where the white population of students was staying pretty much stable. So what ends up happening, those black schools become overcrowded, and they have to go somewhere else. So what they did, this was a policy of the Milwaukee Public Schools, they put black children and their black teachers on a bus, bused them to south side schools, but kept them totally and completely separate from their white peers. They had no classes with them. They didn't have recess with them. They didn't have lunch with them. Some schools actually had like little campers on the playground where the black kids went to class at. Some schools actually sent those black kids back to the bus to go back to their neighborhood school to eat lunch and then come back. The white kids started school at 8 o'clock. The black kids started school at 9 o'clock. So these are things that we don't know because nobody teaches us these things. And as a result of it, we as Milwaukeeans can say, well, we're not as bad as Mississippi. And I say, that's a myth. If you look at how those things played out and how those things are impacting us still today, our educational system did not work well for black children then. We boycotted schools in Milwaukee in the 60s. Didn't matter. The schools have not improved very much. The outcome for black students is still one of the worst in the country. And for white students, Wisconsin is one of the states that has the highest level of achievement for white kids. So when we think about kind of where we are living in the North, living in the Midwest, we have to also remember that we had sundown towns throughout the North and throughout the Midwest. And these were towns, many of them around Milwaukee, that said, when the sun is down, your black behind better be out of town. Wauwatosa had an ordinance on the books that said when the sun went down, black people couldn't be in Wauwatosa. The police would literally look for black people walking down the street, throw them in the back of the police car, drive them to the border of Milwaukee, and say, don't come back until the sun comes up the next day. 16 of the 18 suburbs of Milwaukee used racial restrictive covenants to make sure black people could not move out to places like Tosa in Hales Corners in South Milwaukee. I do a presentation I call The Hidden Impact of Segregation, and I showed one of the racial restricted covenants used in South Milwaukee, which basically said only people that can live here are white people. The mayor of South Milwaukee was there. He came up to me afterwards, and he was like, oh, my goodness, Reggie. Oh, my goodness. What can we do about this? How can we get rid of this, Reggie? And I'm like, chill, dude. They've been unconstitutional since 1968. But how do we get rid of it, Reggie? How do we get rid of it? I said, listen, it was written by a man in 1937. Mr. Hansen wrote it in 1937. I said, if you can go and find Mr. Hansen, he can write an amendment to it to get rid of it. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do about it. And he's like, so what can we do about it? I said, Mr. Mayor, use it as a teachable moment so that people understand why South Milwaukee is 92% white today is because of what they did years ago. And these covenants were legal for decades. And even though they became unconstitutional, they were never enforced by anybody. Laws don't mean anything if they're not enforced. Laws don't mean anything if they don't have an enforcement mechanism written into them. And so the myth of the Midwest being this welcoming place, let's get over it, people.
I think
Thank you.
I think it's important to the ego and the self-esteem of the people in the North, you know, because the bad people, the bad, racist, ignorant people in the South, they not only practiced slavery, they believed in it. We're separate and different from them. And so in many ways, you know, you're thinking about the Civil War too, that was part of that it was a moral war. Only bad people believe in racism and slavery. Up here, we don't believe in that. But of course, we know that that's not true. I have a sister who lives in Georgia. I'm from Gary. We're from Gary, which is an all-black town. We moved up here since we were a child, and the first time I experienced racism was as a little black girl in a Milwaukee public school, but was predominantly white. The first time I'd ever been called a porch monkey in my life. I just moved up here. I came from an extremely positive black environment, pro-black household, militant black household, because my parents and my aunts and uncles experienced firsthand segregation and violence. I still have stories that sit in my mind today that hurt whenever I talk to my family or see my family and think about what they had to experience when they were little kids in school. My mom tells a story of the first day of integration when they were bused out to an all-white school and they had the football team waiting for them. With these little black kids, when I got off the bus, the football team was waiting for them. And they threw bricks and they threw stones and they threw everything that they can find. And then after school, they were waiting for them. Outside the school, the football team was waiting for them and they chased them. And they assaulted them. My mom was one of those that fought back, and so they didn't mess with her, but they messed with the rest of them. And so I experienced a similar thing, except I didn't experience physical violence. I experienced psychic violence, psychological violence, and emotional violence. And so I'd always been really curious about that, about Milwaukee. And I remember just growing up, as I read and I learned, and I talked to people here, it was this really interesting thing that people would always say to me, and it was usually white folks that would say to me, you know, Milwaukee is the most segregated city. And they would stop right there and be like, and talk about something else. So one day I said, why? And they didn't know what to say. And I said, I'm really curious and interested in the fact that people, residents, native residents of Milwaukee will be quick to point out, like it's some type of, you know, special or unique thing about the city, and not necessarily a good way, but nobody ever discusses the why. I'm curious as to why. You people were born and raised here. I was not. Why don't you know? Why can't you have a deeper conversation about why the city is segregated? Don't come tell me that, and you can't explain to me why. So I found out why on my own. A really good book for those of you who are curious or interested in further reading is Selma of the North. And that book really opened my eyes. That's when I learned about the sundown towns in Wisconsin. But the form of racism here is a very insidious one because it's invisible. And it comes in the forms of micro-assaults and microaggressions. And so back to what I was saying, I was talking to my sister who lives in Georgia, and I said to her, how could you live down there? How could you ever live in the South? she told me about a story when she went to college, and she was down there with some friends who were natives and some transplants, and they went to a small town outside of the university they were at, and a white couple came walking down the street, and the native students, they stepped off the sidewalk to let the white couple pass, and my sister and the other people who were transplants kept walking. So my sister said to them, "What are you doing?" And then they said, "Well, what are you talking about?" They hadn't even realized what they were doing. It was so unconscious at that point, because you do know part of the slave codes and black codes were that you could not walk. If a white person was walking down the street, same side of the street, you had to step off of the sidewalk and step into the gutter. You can't look white people in the eyes. And some of that is just so a part of their socialization, deeply ingrained, part of their cultural memory, that people just do these things without even thinking. And so when my sister told me that story, I asked her, I was like, "I can't believe you live in the South knowing all of that. And then slavery, like," and she said, "Well, tell me this." She said, when I go to a store or when I drive to a smaller town outside of where I'm located here in Georgia, she said, "I know I can tell, or people tell me, places that I'm not welcome." She was like, you can walk in the door of some store shops, and so the owner will come out and say, "We don't serve the N-word here." She said, "I know, they're upfront with their racism. If you walk down the street, they will call you the N-word." She said, "I don't have to ever guess what people feel about me. In the North, I'm always curious about, did I not get that job because my name sounds too black? When I walked in the door for the interview and they told me that they decided to go with somebody else, was it me? Is this police officer following me because I'm black?" So all of your experiences here, you're always questioning whether or not it's because you're black. And she said, in the South, I don't have to question. I know they're because I'm black. And she said, "So which would you rather live with? Would you rather live with that anxiety and that questioning, or would you rather live with the truth right in your face?" And she said it actually is psychologically and emotionally worse to always be questioning whether there's racism. And then so I thought about that, and I was just like, well, this narrative about the North, and I said that I actually agree with that. Now, I don't think at this point I could position myself in the South at this point, but I said, you're absolutely right. I think that is part of the harm here, is because the North continues to uphold this narrative of morality, that they will not openly admit how racist the North is and what the people here actually suffer under this form of racism, which is insidious and invisible. And so what you were talking about, the disparities in health and infant mortality rates, there was a really great documentary called When the Bow Breaks, and they followed these black women. And they were middle-class black women with, I think one was like a doctor and some other high-level, high-paying professions. And so they were studying the disparities in infant mortality rates amongst black women. And so they, picked out the obvious things. This is the doctors, the medical community. They were looking at obvious things like environment. So it must be the environment. So they went and they followed and studied these women, black women who lived in poor and impoverished areas, and said, well, this must be the reason why they're high in infant mortality rates, is because their social class standards of living. So they did some comparison between the poor black women and the women who were middle and upper class, and there actually was no statistical significant difference between infant mortality rates of poor black women and infant mortality rates of middle class black women. They did all kind of things trying to find out. They were like, oh, well, maybe we have to look at, if it's not environment, maybe it's social class, maybe it's stress. All of these things they couldn't find out. And then so they started looking at people who were first and second generation migrants from Africa. And they said, well, maybe it's something genetic, maybe biological about black women and the reason why there are these high infant mortality rates. And so what they ended up finding in first generation immigrants of black women from Africa, that they didn't have the same levels of infant mortality rate. There weren't the same disparities found in first generation migrant populations from Africa as they were here. But what happened when they followed second and third generation children of African migrants here, they had the same levels of infant mortality rates. And so the medical community still stumped. Here comes sociologists. Hey. Okay. We're important people. They came in and they started to look at things like stress, and a particular type of stress, psychological stress, stress from racism. And that's the connection that they made. Social class didn't matter, environment didn't matter. And the reason why the second and third generation populations of African migrants were impacted, but not their parents who migrated directly from Africa, because they came from, like me, probably like you growing up, they came from spaces where they were valued, their identity was valued, and people looked like them. And so when you grow up in a validating and affirming environment in terms of your racial and ethnic identity, it provides a protective layer for you. There's some sort of protection that you get from a socialization around positiveness around your racial and ethnic identity. So for people who live in America, you don't have that protection that you get from living in a positive and affirming space for your racial and ethnic identity. So folks from Africa, I'm from in the United States, but it was a small black town. And so there was a layer of protection that I kind of had with that. So, I mean, I say all this to say this, that the North is just as racist. It's just you have to, we have to discuss the type of racism that exists here in the many forms, the permutations of it, and look at how it impacts us differently. So, sorry for taking all the time.
Well, I don't have a ton to add, and obviously I wouldn't want to add to those deep experiences or to go over them. But one thing I will say is from the white perspective, I think that peculiarly in Milwaukee, being a northern city with a very strong white, progressive, and working class and immigrant identity, I think that covers a multitude of sins. It allows people to tell, again, these myths and stories about themselves and about it's very similar to what I was describing about the U.S. and the stories it tells about itself. I think Milwaukee tells stories about itself that, again, it's only just beginning to come over because it's confronted by those horrendous statistics. And so I think you see the same kind of thing happening in Milwaukee as well, that, oh no, we can't be like that because we've got sewer socialism, right? We're progressive. We don't do those kinds of things. Well, sewer socialists were racist too. So.
That's a perfect segue because my next question is about white fragility. So something that I read to supplement my 1619 reading was the 2018 nonfiction book, White Fragility, by Rob and D'Angelo. In this book, D'Angelo examines why white people have such a hard time dealing with anything regarding race, even, as she cites as an example in the book, people of color suggesting that the term flesh tone may not be the best option when naming a singular crayon. She further argues that this fragility is intentional and a crucial key to upholding white supremacy. There is a sentence in the book that she has italicized that says, white progressives do the most damage to people of color. Can you explain this?
Wow, that's a deep question.
Thank you.
So, Dr. King, how many of you guys remember Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail? Remember that? One of the things that he said in that letter, he was basically chastising all of those white liberals who were not living up to the ideals of their Christian beliefs. He's basically saying that you're promoting that you're Christians and that you have love for everybody, but you're not standing up for what's right in front of you as we're being mistreated. So there's been a long history of whites who have wanted to be allies with blacks in our struggle. My mentor, Dr. James Cameron, the founder of America's Black Holocaust Museum, talked about how he wanted the museum to be a place that talked about the struggles of black people and all of those freedom-loving whites that have been with us along our journey in America. As you study that, and as I've studied African American history and studied Latino history and studied Native American history, studied Asian American history, I've tried to study as many different groups as possible to get a more nuanced understanding of American history, right? And what I tell people all the time is that I've learned more about white people by studying those other groups than I could have ever learned otherwise. Yeah. And part of what I've learned is that there is a reluctance for white people to admit that what we say about our country, the mythology of our country, is a bunch of lies. We have a hard time as Americans admitting that we've been lied to. White people love those myths of, George Washington. But you know what George Washington was known as by the Native Americans? They called him the town destroyer. because he literally ordered troops to destroy Native American communities and kill every man, woman, and child in those communities. So when we think about whites who have been progressive-minded liberals, there's still a reluctance on the part of some of them to grasp that the way they see these struggles of Native Americans, African Americans, all these different people of color, the way they see that experience and the way they understand it does not have the same level of clarity as those people have themselves. You can never understand the experiences of a group of people if you're not part of that group. That's just point blank. I could never understand the experience of sexism that women deal with because I'm not a woman. So when whites who are progressives and want to help out, different communities, one of the mistakes they make is that they assume we need their help. Listen, this is what I tell all the progressive whites who want to help the black community in Milwaukee. 2 things you can do. Number 1, work on the white people in your life. Racism is a white people problem. White people created racism. White people created the concept. This false concept of race was created as a justification to treat Africans and Native Americans different than everybody else. So work on your friends. Work on your family members. Work on Uncle Bob that says that same racist joke every Thanksgiving dinner. Work on your neighbor. Work on your bowling buddy. Work on those people before you come trying to help us. Because what you can do for our community by coming and assisting us with different programs and blah, 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 all that stuff that makes you feel good, that's not doing anything to eliminate racism. I tell people that if you really want to do work, you have to become an anti-racist. Not being racist and being an anti-racist is not the same thing. Not being racist is wonderful. Thank you so much for not being racist. I appreciate it. But I want you to fight other people who you know are racist. Because when we think of racism in America, it's not individual acts of racism that matter that much. It matters, obviously. But what's really important are the institutions that perpetuate the same inequalities decade after decade, after century. And the other thing, when you do come into the black, Latino, Hmong community, whatever community you come into to help, come in with a sense of humbleness. Don't come in telling people what they need to do. Don't come in telling people that I've designed this program and you should do X, Y, and Z. Come in and do what I learned as a little boy in Mississippi. My great-grandfather told me this. He said, you know what, boy? You have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen twice as much as you talk, right? So when you come into those communities, don't come in talking to people. Come in asking questions. How do you see these issues? What can I do to help? Because this is what people are going to tell you. What we're lacking are access to the resources to fix our communities. You have access to the resources because all of the resources are controlled by white people. You look at Milwaukee and you see the major institutions in the city of Milwaukee, they're all in control of white people. You know, we got some black elected officials. Oh, that's wonderful, but listen. We understand the reality in our community that as a black elected official, you can't become the black politician that works for black people because you have to be the elected official for everyone in the community. You can't possibly say you're going to do things for black people. But as a white person, as a politician, you don't have to say, well, I'm going to just hook up white folks. Nobody challenges you when that's all you do is hook up white folks. Nobody says, well, how come you're not helping the black community? How come you're not helping the Latino community? How come you're not helping the Asian community, Native American community? Nobody ever asks a white politician that. But as soon as a person of color is a politician and they create a program for their community, all of a sudden they're a reverse racist, right? So we have to get it in our minds that if we want to be allies in this, the way to be an ally is to fight to change the people that have control of the institutions. and they're people that look like you, not like me.
I agree with everything you said. So just being in the community, working in various spaces, most of the work that I've been doing has been around some form of race, gender, class, just social justice, and equity work. And one of the things, the thorns in my side are always white liberal progressives, because they attach to you and they suck the life out of you. Liberal vampires. Here's a black woman. She's articulate. She got access to the community. I need to learn. Let me learn. I need some new language. They walk up to me. Hi, Amber. Hi, Karen. So, here we go. All of a sudden, Karen is my best friend. Can't shake her off my back. And then Karen starts sounding like me. She uses all the words that I use. Karen, you can't use those words. I'm a black woman. I can use those words. You can't use those words, Karen. So it becomes a burden of responsibility for me, right? So I'm responsible for her own personal growth and development. And she'll use the right term. She'll say, as a white woman with privilege, oh my God, just because you say that, you're conscious of your falsely constructed racial identity, Karen, it doesn't make you unracist. It doesn't mean that all your identity work is done because you say you are a white woman with privilege. It doesn't even mean that you examine your privilege and you do something about it. You have now these buzzwords that you use to gain access to people like me, so you can suck the life out of me. So Karen, she will say things like, I just really want to be an ally. And when I go into these communities and I talk about being an ally, when you're in these communities of color, do they use the words ally? A lot of black and brown folks that I'm around, when they talk about doing the work of surviving, they don't use the word ally. And then so I say, that's brilliant. I'm going to use that. Okay. So now this becomes a burden. And then the emotional burden, right? So I just feel so terrible. I just don't know what to do. So then now I have to help you heal emotionally too. Oh, okay. So I'm responsible for your learning. I'm responsible for your own just tell me. If I say something racist, tell me. Just let me know. I'll correct it. Okay, so now I'm also responsible for that too. I'm already a professor to about 70 students, and now I got this grown adult student named Karen, the liberal vampire. Now she's one of my students. So we have independent study. Do all this teaching inside the classroom. Okay, Karen. Every event we go to in the community, here she is, she's at my side. You know my friend Amber? Yeah, that gains her access. Okay, so now you're using my name to gain you access. And then when you go into those spaces, you're committing harm. And you say to me, well, I just don't know why they didn't seem responsive. I just don't know why. Oh, so it's their fault that they didn't respond to you as a white woman, Karen? Well, what did I do wrong? And then, so now I have to teach you again. So for me, it has always been that case. And I like what Reggie said, that if you want to do the work on yourself. Do the work in your community. Do the work in your families. We have been able to survive many, many things. And we will continue to survive this. We have uplifted ourselves. We have made our own, built our own. We will continue to do that. Like Reggie said, we need the resources. The savior complex. The savior complex is highly problematic, and I know that people, on the basis of humanity in their hearts, they want to help because they know that racism and all the oppression that accompanies it is so wrong. And I know genuinely people feel really good about this. But that savior complex is problematic because it is rooted in your own ego. It is never about the communities of color. It is about you. You need to continue to make yourself feel better because when Uncle Bob, I'm gonna add some characteristics to Uncle Bob, if you don't mind. On Thanksgiving, Uncle Bob then bust out the bottle of wild turkey. I don't know if any of y'all have wild turkey. Anybody that drinks wild turkey got problems. Got his little whiskey glass, wild turkey, starts telling this story, this racist story. and you don't say anything, but you go, oh, Uncle Bob, and then you go talk about him. Thank God you only have to see him once a year. Yep. So you don't feel guilty about not addressing that, or that coworker who says, oh my God, I was so scared. I went to Walmart late at night, 24-hour Walmart, and there was this black guy that walked past, and oh my God, I was so scared. And that was the end of her story. She didn't say anything else. But you know what it meant, and you didn't say anything. You know, all the time you go into online spaces, your Facebook and the family, the people that you know that post things and say things, and you know what they meant, but you don't say anything. So that is the type of problems, because your awareness is just one part of it. And your awareness also is rooted in a type of tunnel vision, because examining your identity, you're examining your privilege is not a one-time thing. It's a thing that you'll be doing for the rest of your life, because socialization around white supremacy and racism is so deeply ingrained and is reinforced throughout your entire life. It's in every institution, it's in every medium, every platform, everywhere you go, so you think you've done the work and you haven't. And I think once people start to consider themselves liberal progressive is when the identity work stops, because they think that they know enough to where that they can be comfortable with themselves and know that they're not racist. And I think that that's an issue. I think that it is not necessarily, it's not important to us what you call yourself, progressive or liberal. I don't think that when I work with communities that don't look like me, I don't go into those spaces on the basis of me being progressive or liberal. I go into those spaces on the basis of me being a human being. So, you know.
Okay, so yeah, said pretty much everything, but so I think, I mean, I guess I can talk about it from my own experience. I think I got a little hang of white fragility when you invited me. So I was like, can I do this? Is this gonna like be scary and bad for me? But I think actually when I was thinking through this, when you were both speaking, what really made me think of in my own experience was when I first started getting involved in social and racial justice in the Milwaukee area, which was through the Coalition for Justice. And when I first joined those meetings, I am quite sure I talked way too much. I took up space. I thought that as the parent of a black child, as the sibling of a black woman, as somebody who's been studying race for much of my adult life, that I had stuff that I could contribute, and I even had an obligation to contribute it. And the black-centeredness of that space was a bit of a shock to me. And it took me a while to adjust to it, and to realize, yeah, that I needed that humility, that I needed to listen to your grandpa, great-grandpa, so. That when stuff happens like that, that challenges me, that decenters me, that I cannot go and say, hey, Amber, what did I do wrong? Please help me do it better next time. That I got to figure that out on my own, because Amber's doing with enough. And again, you don't need a second independent study along with Karen. So
Can I get a time check? I don't have my phone on me. It's 8? Oh my goodness. Okay, that means we have one more question, guys. Then we're gonna open it up to you all. So you better be ready. As we learn and grow, especially in conversations around race, how can we all be braver?
I think it depends on what you consider brave. People define brave in different ways. Some people think if they come to an event like this is being brave.
It's not.
Some people, assume that if they do things that other people in the community aren't doing, that they're being brave. I look at it like this. Real bravery comes in your personal relationship part of your life. When you challenge Uncle Bob, who's been drinking wild turkey,
He uses whiskey stones.
Yeah, yeah. When you say something to Uncle Bob, that's being brave to me. Because being an anti-racist means that you're going to lose relationships with somebody. When you challenge people, when you challenge Uncle Bob may not want to see you anymore. When you challenge that person at work who was on the elevator telling you that story about how afraid they were, that person may not want to talk to you anymore. There's a woman I met, and she gave me permission to tell this story. I met several years ago. This is a woman who the tradition in her family, every Sunday, was her and her siblings and her parents sat down for dinner every Sunday. Every Sunday. They never missed a Sunday. And she was at Sunday dinner with her family, and this was right after Trayvon Martin had been murdered by George Zimmerman in Sanford, Florida. And she was like really, really upset that this 17-year-old kid who was doing nothing wrong was killed and that they hadn't arrested George Zimmerman. You know, people forget that they didn't arrest him for a while. You know, the stand your ground law, nonsense. So anyway, she's at dinner with her family, and she mentioned, you know, Trayvon Martin and how upset she was. Literally, before she could get those words completely out of her mouth, her father went off, started cursing at her, telling her, don't ever bring up the name of an N-word in my house again, and just is going on and on and on. And she's sitting there, and she's wondering, like, is my brother going to say something? Are my sisters going to say something? Will my mom say something? Will somebody defend me? Will somebody tell him to stop attacking me? And nobody did. And as a result of that, she's never had Sunday dinner with her family again. Her relationship with her siblings, gone. Her relationship with her parents disappeared. And as she was telling me this story, she said, you know what? It was in a facilitated dialogue group. And she said, I've never been able to tell anybody that story before. I've never told anybody. This is the first time I've ever said this to people. And she said, you know what? I feel good now. I feel good because I don't feel that I did anything wrong. And I realized that if my family felt the way they felt about Trayvon Martin, that they were okay with him being murdered by this man, that my father attacked me and my mother didn't defend me, that my two sisters didn't defend me, that my brother didn't defend me, that they were all okay with it too. And she says, I realized after a lot of heartache that I didn't want to be around them anymore, regardless of the relationship I had with them before. I didn't want to have a relationship with people that felt like that anymore. And she says at first it bothered her a lot, but ultimately it led her to a place where she had a level of peace about her. So if you're going to be an anti-racist, you're going to lose some friends, family members. Your bowling team will kick you off. Your neighbors won't invite you over to watch the Packer games anymore. A lot of bad things are going to happen to you if you do the work and you're brave about it. Being brave means that you're willing to risk relationships with people that you care about. Friends, family members, co-workers, whatever. If you're really willing to lose those relationships and be okay with it, that's when you're really being brave. That's what I define bravery as, willing to lose those relationships, because we hold on tight to relationships, but if you can let them go, that means that you're moving in the right direction. You're okay with being a person who doesn't want to stand and just be a bystander when racism is occurring right in front of them on a daily basis. That's bravery to me.
I'm just going to agree and piggyback off of that. I think absolutely. I think to be brave is breaking your relationship ties or breaking solidarity with white supremacy. You got to break up with white supremacy. It's a violent relationship. It's an abusive relationship, even for white folks, right? What it even does to you psychologically. I was talking about this earlier. White folks, because you are not asked to, because race doesn't impact you, to examine what whiteness means, what in terms of race, because you're not impacted by race in that type of way. It's really interesting. I was in a class one time, and a white woman in class, she was talking something about, I think it was during break time, and she had mentioned something about a shooting or something on the north side, and she was saying, oh, the violence in the black community. I'm going to call her Karen, because I'm just on the roll today. And she said, I just don't know what they're going to do. And I said, well, Karen, what do y'all do about white on white violence in the white community? What does the white community do? I said, maybe we can look to you for answers. Karen said, the white community? There is no such thing as a white community. And I said, wow. You don't even see yourself as a community because you don't have to. You get to live free, liberated, individual lives while everything we do is a community. One that we created, and one that we uphold, and one that y'all created. And we have formed solidarity through oppression. Not all black folks were kidnapped from the same spaces, and not all black folks have the same ideals in mind. But when one black person does something on one side of the country, the entire black community is indicted. When one white person does something, that is their individual act, and it is no reflection on whiteness at all or the white community. Okay. But the one thing, so whiteness may not be something that bonds you all to something that doesn't impact you, but white supremacy does. It's a culture. So breaking up with that violent relationship, psychologically it has to. For people who are really concerned, empathetic, care, knows what racism does and how it impacts people of color, how can you not hurt from that? How can you not? When you hear the stories, even if you haven't seen them. I had to talk to my students. I was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement so that they understood. Said, Black Lives, my mother's a police officer, retired. My sister's a sergeant, Milwaukee Police Department. And I said, Black Lives Matter, it's not just about police brutality. I put out the slides, photos of lynchings in the South, Emmett Till. I just read they had to replace Emmett Till's memorial. Yep, because they keep shooting it up. Mm-hmm. I put out slides of lynchings. And the most important thing, besides the strange fruit hanging from the tree, are the looks on the faces of the crowd. Mm-hmm. The mother, the father, the smiling son pointing at the strange fruit hanging from the tree. The mother there. It's a Sunday affair, right? Lynchings are still going on. We just don't hear about them. So to not be impacted, how can you not? I know how people cannot, but those that are impacted by that, right? You have to break up with that relationship. It requires all those things, speaking up at times even when you don't feel comfortable. Because the thing is there's a lot of people who really want to say stuff to their family members and to their coworkers, but I think unconsciously, people know that whiteness also means power and access to power. And so once you break solidarity with white folks, once they can't trust you to tell a racist joke in front of you, because once you say something, they're not going to trust you anymore. Well, I just feel like I can't say anything, right? Because you already have born into this white solidarity to where they know they can say all these racist things in front of you and you're not going to go tell. But the minute you say something, they can't trust you anymore. I don't even know if I can have you around anymore. And so to break ties with that power source of whiteness, that is bravery. To know that you may be left out on your own without having access to white power, that is bravery. That's all I got.
Yeah. Again, both of those kind of big things. Taking the risks, but also I think as a kind of follow-up to both of those things is constantly asking if you're actually doing that, constantly checking yourself and saying, am I really taking a risk for this? Am I, again, coming back to the wanting to see yourself as a savior, am I actually having an impact, or am I having more of an impact on my own ego? It's so easy, it's so comfortable, it's so nice to measure yourself by that standard, but you have to, we have to look at ourselves and say, you know, what am I really actually doing what am I risking and what am I achieving? How am I transferring that power to people who deserve it as much as I do, but don't have it because of all these structures? How am I transferring the dignity, the humanity, to people who have been deprived of it because of these structures? And it's really hard, and it's really unpleasant when you catch yourself falling short, but you do, and you've just got to try to make it, try to be true to yourself and true to, okay, this is what I really want. I don't want the vanity project. I want to transform, and hopefully that's something we can all kind of bring ourselves to. And we never get there, but we've got to keep pushing ourselves to sacrifice more.
And don't give up, because I see too many people, and this is also, again, ego-centered. I've seen too many people who this is just too much for me. This is too heavy. I can't see people suffering like this. I just don't know if I can do this work. I don't know if it's cut out for me, and they go cry in a corner. You don't know if you could do this work. I don't know if I could live this life. I ask myself that every day. And you don't know if you can do this work, and you're crying about it. Guess what? Karen, I don't get to cry. Don't give up. You're going to be wrong. You're going to make mistakes. Socialization around white supremacy, you've experienced that in your entire life. It's ingrained. It's in all the institutions. It is going to take your entire lifetime to erase that stuff from your brain. You have to keep going. You're going to mess up. A person of color is going to call you out and be like, "Ooh, what did you just say?" But you can't. If you shut down and give up because you keep getting it wrong, that's about you. And it's not about the people that you're trying to work with or work for. That's about you. When you feel like you need to give up, it's about you. That's your ego. So I think that is really important, that I wanted to end with that, about you have to keep doing it. Even if it looks wrong, Karen, call you out.
I want to add something to that. This is what I think everybody in the room, if you haven't read this book, you need to read this book. You've heard people say that a fish is in the water all the time and they never see the water, right? It's the same with racism in America for white people. You live in it all the time. There's a sociologist, Joe Fagan, Texas A&M University, one of my favorite people on the planet Earth. He wrote a book called The White Racial Frame to articulate to you how this frame of reference that all of us as Americans are taught to see the world from. This is one of the tools I use when I educate people about racism. You can't see it because, just as you said, it doesn't impact your life. You don't have to think of yourself as a racial group. And, you know, as you were saying that, I was thinking like, man, how many times have you been in a situation where you listen to the news and there's somebody that committed some horrific act and you're with a bunch of black people and say, I hope that ain't somebody black.
I do that.
I hope it wasn't a black person, right?
Please don't let this be a black person.
Right?
And then it would be a white kid or something, like, oh, thank God.
Yeah, like relieved.
Absolutely.
But this is what happens when you're part of an oppressed group. You have to accept group responsibility, group guilt. And I always use the same example. When Jeffrey Dahmer was eating people in Milwaukee, white people did not feel guilty about being white. Not a single white person. Like, oh my goodness, it's terrible to be white right now. We got white people eating people. But black people, somebody black does something, we're like, man, here we go again. We are our own worst enemies. I hear this. Every time I hear somebody that said, I want to just like, somebody said that to me last week, and I was like, please, don't say that again. She's like, what? I said, please don't say that black people are their own worst enemies. She said, well, we are. We do this, and we do that, and we do. I said, white people do that too. Every white person is not friendly with every white person. White people are very competitive with each other. Study a little bit about American history and see how white people in America have mistreated each other. Read about the 1924 immigration law that basically said, we're okay with some white people coming to the country, but those from Southern and Eastern Europe, we don't want them anymore. We don't want the Italians coming anymore. We don't want any Sicilians coming. We don't want any Greeks coming. We don't want any Russian Jews coming. And they literally cut immigration by 97% Because too many of those white people that came to the country.
Wait, but you cannot use that to compare that experience to the experience of what is going on now with the restriction of immigration of brown folks from the South. I just want to point that out because white people will do that a lot. They will go,
Oh, yeah.
well, the Irish were slaves.
Right, right. But what I'm saying,
were.
though, is that listen, America is an equal opportunity discriminator. We discriminate against any and everybody. Every group that lives in America has had an experience where they've been discriminated against. However, if you study American history, you will find that not a single group, any group you pick, has had more laws written specifically with their racial name in the law as black people. Nobody is even close. Black codes, how many of you heard of the one-drop rule before? Never existed. It's a myth. Every state defined black differently. I've been looking at how different states define it. Alabama defined it different than Mississippi. If you're in Alabama, if one of your grandparents is black, you black. In Mississippi, any black ancestor, you black. So you could literally go from one state to the next, be black in one state, and then not black in the other state, by definition. There's no laws written about what white means, ever. That's white privilege, I think.
Okay. I'm opening it up to the floor now. If you want me to come down there and hand you a mic, I can. I have to take my shoes off. Okay. TC's going to do it. So if you have anything to say to the panelists or ask or a point that you would like to be touched, perfect. Take it away.
My bad. No, I just wanted to ask, what's more books to look up the history of Milwaukee with besides the Selma of the North?
Joe Trotter's book, Black Milwaukee, The Making of a Black Proletariat, 1915 to 1945. It's a great book. He does a phenomenal job talking about the history of blacks up until 1940. He's actually working on continuing that history after 1945, looking. There's not a whole lot of books that have been written about the black experience in Milwaukee. It's very few. But there are a lot of books that have been written about the black experience nationwide that apply to Milwaukee. Probably one of the most popular books that people have been reading over the last couple of years is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, about the history of segregation. Mr. Rothstein has been in Milwaukee a couple of times. I've co-presented with him. When you look at kind of how segregation developed, it developed, the same tools are used all over the country. And so when you read about those tools, they apply to Milwaukee. It's really hard to find a scholarship on the black experience in Milwaukee because people don't seem to be all that interested in writing about it. But I always say that the experiences, Milwaukee isn't really all that different from most other places. The thing that's different about Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Milwaukee is that black people went to those cities earlier than they did to Milwaukee. So they were able to actually build kind of a middle class in those communities and build like a Hyde Park neighborhood. I met a young guy last year who works at a company in Milwaukee, and he grew up in Detroit in one of the kind of wealthy black suburbs of Detroit, and then he moved to Chicago and he lived in Hyde Park, and then he got a job in Milwaukee. He was like, oh man, where's the Hyde Park neighborhood in Milwaukee? Everybody's like, dude, there ain't no neighborhood like that in Milwaukee. Black people that are making $100,000 a year or more as a family are more likely to live in a high poverty neighborhood in Milwaukee than they are in any other city. So, you study about other places and you can apply a lot of those things to Milwaukee. I would advise you to read Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and really get to the depths of how segregation has impacted us. And then Joe Trotter's book, Black Milwaukee. And then Selma of the North is written by Patrick Jones. Patrick Jones is the author.
Yes, interesting. Esteemed panel, I'm really enjoying the discussion. Here we are in Milwaukee, most segregated city, they say, the city of festivals, and we have no Afrofest. But what I would like to talk about is racism within the race. And is that become systemic here in Milwaukee?
So first, I'd like to address, I think what you're describing as intercultural racism. So I like to give this formula and this little litmus test as a test for racism, because I have to cover this every semester with my students. People use terms like reverse racism. And I always say, people of color can't be racist. Black people can't be racist towards other black people. People of color can't be racist. And I say, people can be prejudiced. Everybody's got prejudice, attitudes, biases. But there's a formula for racism. And the formula for racism is a prejudice attitude plus power. You have to be able to act on your attitude and act in a specific type of way that excludes, marginalizes, and oppresses people. So I always give my students this little test. I said, okay, so people of color, they can be racist towards other people of color or racist towards white people. I say we have to be able to answer yes to all of these questions. Tell me a time in history when people of color have excluded white people from voting. Tell me a time in history when white people have excluded white people from living where they want to live. Tell me a point in history where white people have had their land stolen from people of color and either not given it back or given it back with conditions. Tell me a time where people of color have discriminated against white people for employment. Name for me more than 5 wealthy billionaire people of color. Name for me more than 5 people of color on the Forbes list. Tell me how many presidents that are people of color. Name for me. And so I start going down this list, and I said, see, you have to have the power to exclude people from participating in society at the political, economic, and social level. That's how you can be racist. Other than that, we don't have the power to be racist. We don't have the power to exclude people. So I just wanted to start there. And so what you're talking about, I think, is internalized oppression. And that's what it seems like. I just had this conversation today just about my experience being here in Milwaukee with another person who was not from Milwaukee. And my mom and my aunt and I talk about this all the time, that I've always felt the atmosphere is just different here with a lot of black folks. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to talk about. So you're from Gary, which is migrated, blacks from the South migrated. So there's this Southern feel, culture type of thing where growing up, you don't walk past a person without nodding, saying hello or anything like that. And just some of the outright cold and unfriendliness that I've experienced within my own community. And I've come to rest on this. Because we fail to admit the insidious form of racism here, people internalize it, black people internalize it, and go on about their daily lives. And I see a lot of people living in survival mode, which y'all know, anybody does any type of trauma work, that is not healthy at all, physically or psychologically, to be living in survival mode every day. And because we don't talk about racism in the city of Milwaukee here openly, open, frank, public discussions like that, there isn't an opportunity for the people who are impacted the most by it to release, to heal from it, to deal with it, to confront it, all the work that has to be done. And so I noticed there's a different feel from a lot of the black people here. And it's not acceptance of oppression. I think it is more of, this is how it is, and I'm gonna continue to survive. So interculturally, like what we experience amongst each other, that I see a lot of issues with class, social class, unfortunately, the way capitalism works and combined with its bedfellow racism, to know that you have made it in this country, you have material wealth, you have material things. And so when black people, just like any other group, acquire material things, they want nice houses. But for black people, because of the way that segregation has worked here, to have the really, really nice houses, you can't live in a black community. And so you have black folks that are distanced from their own communities. And then when they go back into their own communities, people know you not from there. And they're gonna treat you different because they already know. Because what I learned from having a few degrees and things like that, what the doors of opportunity have opened up for me was my proximity to whiteness. That changed. The more education I got, the closer to whiteness and white power I got to. And my people sensed that on me. They can smell it on me when I walk into spaces. And then some people don't trust me because they know I'm sitting right at the power source because of where my degrees get me. And my people don't like that. And I feel that, and I understand that. And so I feel that's my interpretation of a lot of what I've seen. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but for one thing,
Yeah.
the systemic part of it, is
Yes.
do black people in positions, oh, thank you, black people in positions, are they more apt to protect that position? Has it become systemic? I mean, people who are coming up from the community and want to access those powers have a tendency to run into some of their own people in positions who tend to block that progress. So that's what I mean by the act, and that is an act of racism because you're in a position of power and you'll be able to inflict and impose that on people of your own race right here in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've always, my mom always told me, just because people look like you don't mean they're for you. Even though this is a part of racial oppression and conditioning and slavery, that, the overseers were black too. Right. On the plantation. So there's that. But it's because we're bound to community, because we don't really have any other choice. We don't get to live individual lives, and we always unconsciously are operating as a community. So when we see a person of color in a leadership position, we're expecting things from them. We're expecting behavior. We're expecting acceptance. We're expecting them to help us in certain type of ways, and then we don't necessarily get that. So I guess I'm conflicted about that, because on the one hand, somebody in a leadership position, now given that they're not, trying to oppress the other people of color behind them, why can't they just be in a leadership position and just live their life? Why is everything that black people do has to be at the benefit of the black community? Why does everything that we do we always have to worry about how this is gonna benefit, or people question how what we're doing benefits the black community? We don't get to live individual lives. We don't really get to live capitalism freely, acquire our wealth, and then go isolate ourselves. We don't get to do that. People question us, right? So, and the leadership, they're doing, capitalism is also a part of our culture and socialization. So in a sense, those people are just doing what you would do in a capitalist country. You got this position, making this good money, you're gonna protect and isolate yourself in that type of way. But we're also socialized to expect that they're gonna help us and not oppress us in the same ways that white folks have done. So it is, it's just this really conflict. So this is the psychological part of racism. It's this conflicting space. That's why our lives and our experiences are so complex, because we don't just have these simple, clear-cut type of lives where I can say, I got this job. No, people are gonna question me. People are questioning me about my PhD. Oh, and so how is that gonna help I couldn't have gotten a PhD for myself? Absolutely not. Because guess what happened? When I graduated, it wasn't I got a PhD, it was we. We have a PhD. And I was like, you did all the research? Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to address that too. It's about resources. Black people in Milwaukee, Latino people in Milwaukee, Asian people in Milwaukee don't have access to resources. The measly resources that are there are like crumbs. We fighting over the crumbs, right? And we consistently fighting over the crumbs. That's been our lived experience in Milwaukee. We're fighting over the crumbs, right? And so what happens is people are going to be very competitive. When they get their little 3-4 crumbs, they don't want to share those crumbs with anybody else, because now they got a little piece of that power that they didn't have before. But there's a book I want you to read. There's an author I want you to read. Anybody in the room familiar with Frantz Fanon? Yes. Frantz Fanon, black man born in island Martinique, went to France, went to medical school, became a psychiatrist, got his first job in Algeria as a psychiatrist, working in a mental hospital when the Algerians were trying to kick the French colonial, people out of their country. Over 1 million Algerians lost their lives in that war against the French. They eventually kicked them out. But when he worked there, his first job was at the mental hospital, and this is what he learned. The police and the military from France were brutal to the Algerian people. They would torture people. They would kill people. They did all these horrible things, right? So he had patients who were Algerians. He had patients who were French. His Algerian patients were coming to him because they were dealing with the trauma of being tortured by the police and the military. The French police and military came to him because they were traumatized because they were torturing people, right? So he wrote a series of books talking about how the psychology of oppression works. There's a man by the name of Hussein Bulhan who wrote a book about Frantz Fanon. It's my favorite book in the world. It's called Frantz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. And what he talks about in one of the chapters is what he calls auto-oppressors. When you live in an oppressive society, you're the oppressed group. Eventually, the oppressors don't have to do that much work anymore. You begin to oppress yourself. You begin to take out all of the things that are bothering you on yourself. You become alcoholics. You go home and you beat your wife. So one of the things that Bulhan did was he compared blacks in America to blacks in South Africa. He looked at rates of hypertension. He looked at murder rates. He looked at domestic violence rates. He looked at alcoholism. And he found it was exactly the same in both countries. And what he said in the book is that you are living in a society where you don't have any power, and you find power wherever you can find it, and you hold on to it, right? That's what black people in Milwaukee do. They find a little bit of power, and they hold on to it. Everybody has done this or seen somebody do this. It's called displaced aggression. You're at work, you make a mistake, the boss is yelling at you, you're embarrassed, you can't say anything to the boss. You hold that frustration in until you get home. You get home, the dog runs up to you, you kick the dog across the room, you slap the kids, you beat the wife. You're not mad at any of them. You're mad at your boss. But you have to find a safe, convenient target, and that's what black people do. When we talk about black people and the level of violence within our community, people tend to be violent against people they know. Most people are murdered by somebody they know, not some random dude coming up behind them trying to rob them at the ATM machine. It's usually somebody they know. So within our community here, that auto-oppression is so prevalent. And the reason it's more prevalent now than it was in 1970 is because we weren't fighting for crumbs back in 1970. Black people in Milwaukee in 1970 had the 7th highest median family income for blacks in the country because everybody was working at A.O. Smith, Harnish-Vager, Slits, Pabst, all of those places that left. And instead of them being blamed for leaving, 91,000 manufacturing jobs left Milwaukee from 1963 to 2015. Literally almost 50,000 of those have left since 1980. The jobs that brought black people to Milwaukee left Milwaukee. But instead of people blaming the owners of A.O. Smith or the owners of Pabst or Slits, all these other places that left, they blaming the black community. Oh, black people just lazy. They don't want to work. And so now we're fighting for crumbs when we didn't have to fight for crumbs because we had access to family supporting jobs. And as those family supporting jobs went away, now we're fighting each other over the crumbs. So think about it in that context, is that we don't have access to many of the resources. We're fighting for everything we can get.
Yeah, my question has to do with TV advertising in particular. So I would like to know the opinion of the panel, because when I watch TV, I see African-American families, enjoying their new cell phone technology, driving their luxury car down the road, or I see biracial couples, etc. My question is, why do advertisers do that?
I'm sorry.
Money. Black people have money to spend. We can, some of us can afford a Lexus. He's asking about how advertisers now are more and I think he's saying more likely to see black people in commercials, whereas before they weren't black people in commercials, right?
Successful.
They wouldn't show black families and all that other stuff.
Right, and also biracial.
Yep, biracial.
Why do advertisers take that approach?
Oh,
Because those people have money.
capitalism.
Yeah, it's capitalism 101.
Capitalism is racist, but then it also doesn't care about you. So, it doesn't matter that who the buyer is, who the consumer is. They're just looking for a new consumer group. They sit in marketing meetings. They'd be like, "Oh, I know what population we haven't targeted yet. Let's do a new targeting campaign." Yeah. I just saw Calvin Klein on Instagram. It was just totally displaced. It was like this guy. He looked like Kendrick Lamar, and he's wearing like a Calvin Klein. I said, this doesn't even fit him. He would never wear this. He's a street dude. He would never be walking around the streets of Milwaukee. And this Calvin Klein, get up. What are you doing? But that's capitalism. They don't care. Nobody that looks like that guy in that ad is gonna go purchase those clothes.
But if you notice with the biracial couples, it's usually like if it's a black-white couple, it's a black woman with a white husband. You very rarely see the other way. So there's still some. This is another thing that's related to that but it's actually kind of like in movies. Television shows, movies, right? They have, sex scenes in these movies, right? My brain notices patterns. And one of the patterns that I've noticed is if it's a black couple and they're making love, they show like 15 seconds of them making love. If it's a white couple, they showing all of the foreplay, they showing the sex and the afterplay. They showing everything, every detail. There's still a fear in America of black sexuality, of showing it. And so, there's a lot of dynamics that go on with commercials and movies and all of that. Nat, you probably want to say something too, right? We've been talking a lot.
That's okay.
Sitting over here really nice, like a nice white person. I don't want to bother her.
Thank you for that validation. So I actually wanted to go back to your Calvin Klein example, because part of what you were talking about and what your examples were, what Reggie was saying about them, is an acknowledgement that, capitalist acknowledgement that, hey, guess what? Some black people actually have money to spend, and they want to spend it on some of these products. And maybe sometimes they're going to spend a larger proportion of their income on some of these products because of different cultural values and so on. And also, there are sometimes really expensive things that are so expensive that because of economic racism, many black people can't afford them, so they buy something slightly less expensive, so they buy an SUV instead of a house. Whereas a white family in similar circumstances might make a different economic judgment. So, we see this criticism of people who live in impoverished neighborhoods, black people who live in impoverished neighborhoods, driving around in shiny Escalades, and there's a judgment of that, but it's a judgment that is not acknowledging the economic racism. And the people who do acknowledge that are the advertisers, because they know that they can sell to those populations, and they can use abusive loan terms to get those people's money. But coming back to the Calvin Klein, I think that's something slightly different, because you saying, that guy would not wear that. So they're not advertising to people who look like that guy. They're advertising to white people who want to think they've got that little bit of black cool.
Oh my God.
They want to have that swag.
And they want to imagine that, hey, I can look like that black guy in the ad who doesn't actually exist outside of that photo studio.
And listen, this is a question I heard white people ask. Why do black people buy a car before they buy a house? You know why they buy a car before they buy a house? Because it's easier to buy a car than it is to buy a house. If you look at the records over the last 20 years, or really since the early 2000s, if you look at the rate of people who are turned down for trying to get a mortgage loan, the rate for blacks and Latinos and Asians in Milwaukee is so much lower than it is for whites. With the same credit score, the same, the exact same job history, credit score, all of that. But if you're black, you're much less likely to get that mortgage loan than a white person. When I had a friend years ago, and I met his brother, and we used to play basketball together, and there's a white guy. Didn't work. He bought a house. How do you buy a house when you don't have a job? I don't know any black person that's ever bought a house who didn't have a job, but this white dude bought a house, a nice house. I'm like, how do you get, approved for a loan when you don't have a job, dude? You don't have any income. And I was like, that must be like one of those secrets that white people keeping from us, because it don't happen for us.
Well, yeah, I mean, the pathway to wealth in this country is land ownership. And it's the housing. That's why housing discrimination is one of the things that impacted the black community so much, and it continues to this day. I mean, we talk about that is property. That's why the indigenous folks were killed here for their land. Land is the pathway to wealth, and that's why. And you're absolutely right. I also point out, too, though, the judgment that is passed on, poor black communities for the material things that they have. This is a capitalist country. Capitalism is everywhere. Consumption, consumption, consumption. why you don't think people of color are affected by the same commercials and messages that you see? There's something shiny and new, and it's also saying that poor people don't deserve nice things.
Poor people don't want to look poor. Nobody does, right? So, people, hey, bought those kids those $150 sneakers, and they're renting. They're not even homeowners. How can they waste that money? Because they don't want their kids to go to school with the bootleg sneakers on. When I was a little boy, when we moved to Mississippi, there was a store on North Avenue, like 18th and North. I don't remember the name of it, but that's where we used to get our gym shoes. That was before they had like name brands, right? You went to the section where the shoes were, and it just said gym shoe, right? And I don't know how many of you guys remember getting like the cheapest version of the gym shoe with like the white toe, right? And eventually you would play in the summer for a couple months, and then that white would turn yellow, and then the kids would call your shoes piss wipers, right? That was all my mother could afford to get us. But kids now would not wear those shoes. Their parents would not send them to school with those shoes because they know they would get teased unmercifully. Poor people don't want to look poor. They want to look like everybody else. And so they may spend over their means. However, if you think about it, there's no reason that gym shoes cost $150 to begin with. Capitalism. They spending $3 making these darn shoes and charging $200 for them because they got somebody in Indonesia making these pieces of crap shoes. I bought a pair of Air Jordans once. I was tripping. Now, wait, let me tell you. I was tripping because I play basketball. So I'm like, let me get the best shoes. I went to Foot Locker. Oh, dude, you got to get these. So dude convinced me to buy these Air Jordans, right? Worst shoes I ever had in my life. Really? Absolutely the worst. Listen, the shoes tore up in like 3 weeks. So I went and bought another pair that lasted me for like 2 years. I don't think you're supposed to actually wear Jordans. Right. Yeah. No, this was when people was actually buying them to actually play basketball with, not to be, styling and mad that somebody scuffed their shoes up. This was when people actually wore Jordans to play basketball. I never bought another pair of shoes over $100 again after that because I'm like, it's a waste of money. Sorry, Michael Jordan, but.
Can I get another time check? Okay.
I'm just wondering if my son is somewhere still out there listening to this part of the conversation with his Jordans on.
I have more of a comment. There are so many takeaways from you guys' panel discussion that I don't even know where to begin. But I'm going to go back. I always go back to the slavery days. And a lot of people, white people say, slavery's a long time ago. It's been a long time ago. But there's still a lot of roots practices to the correlation between the now and the then slavery issue. So I'm going to use my professionalism experience. So one of the things that I have, I'm also a researcher of this subject, and so what I've recently encountered was my efforts to be this professional, right? And how I have not been able to somehow accomplish this professionalism because I have not been able to conform to the white status quo. I don't like being white. I don't like acting white. I don't want to look white. So when I come to work, I like to be black. And a lot of people don't accept that. They're like, Terry, you're so articulate, and Terry, you're so smart. You write so well. But I come with my hoops, my attitude, and my sister self. But one of the things that I wanted to get to, the point was this, as to the point about black people kind of having these opposite approaches that kind of go back to the field and to the house. And then in the more modern context of that way. Because I was a bus student, I started off from a bus student to be close to white people, learning their ways, learning how they speak, how they move around each other. And one of the things that white people don't understand is we know y'all better than y'all know yourselves. But y'all don't want to believe that. We were servants to you. We stood behind you while you ate your meals. We cooked your food. We nursed your children. You even had sex with us. And you still dismiss us. But we're not that invisible. You make us invisible, but we're not invisible. And so my point is, like I was trying to share with somebody the other day, what has caused me the most distress after my 2, 3, 4 degrees and all this other stuff is the fact that the closer I get to you, the more agitated I become. And I think of the roots of the field and the house Negro, because the field Negro resented the house Negro because they thought they had it better. But in truth, it was worse, because we were always around you in the mess. And like she has her Karen, I got my Becky. And I can't even describe the amount of harm and stress that I've endured, to the point last year I had to check the F out. And I checked out because I said, you know what, no longer am I going to be apologetic by the fragility of white people, because they don't care enough about me. I am a victim of racial inequity. And I should not have to apologize because you're upset because I'm calling you out on it. And, you know, I'm a truth teller. So when I speak, I get silenced a lot because I have black people who will go rescue white people. And I hate that when they rescue you guys, because they feel sorry, because the looks on your face look like horrors of death. And it becomes frustrating because you guys don't deserve to be nice to you. We're nice. You know, you guys fear us for absolutely no reason. We're the ones in danger every single day. But you fear us, and it's confusing. And so I've learned to be unapologetic of white people, because I just don't care anymore. I cannot exert any more energy caring about how y'all feel. Especially when, like he said, getting houses with no job, becoming bosses for no apparent reason, don't even come to work on time, but you get promotions. You start off with more money. That stuff is real. And then you have the nerve to give me some Becky attitude, that when I confront you, then you run to the supervisor, and now I'm the aggressor. All I do is want to come to work every day and be glad that I have an income. But white people, y'all create so much hostility in a space that we usually take home being in trouble for. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you, Terry,
sharing that.
for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to validate your pain and your distress and your experience and say, I hear you and I know. I had to go to therapy. I had to go to therapy for it, and it was one of the hardest things to admit. I say that most of the violence, the psychic, psychological, and emotional violence that I've experienced on behalf of racism has come from white women in jobs and in school. I could tell you stories. I had one encounter. It wasn't any worse than the other. We have so many encounters. We're socialized around race. That's the very first thing we learn from our parents, how to navigate it, how to survive it. But it doesn't make any less any less traumatic. And think about physiologically where our nervous systems are at. Every time you experience trauma, your brain has to operate differently. It's imagining the trauma of a car accident, right? Imagine how many racist experiences, and we use the analogy of car accidents because racism or racist experience in a car accident, witnessing one or being in one has the same impact on your brain, the way your brain has to work after trauma. So imagine how many car accidents black people have been in throughout their lifespan and where our bodies are. Feel it in our body. I get that. There's a researcher who just put out some research, I think it might be a book, who was talking about statistically the number of white women who own slaves, and not because they inherited them from their husbands, not because they were widowed, because they outright owned them. And so we talk about this a lot. A lot of the violence that white women get away with in institutions because we have been socialized around white women's vulnerability. We all have, white people, white men, white women, black people, black men, black women, we have been socialized around white women's vulnerability. And so when white women commit acts of violence, psychic and psychological violence, they are less likely to be seen as perpetrators. They get to be bully and victim. And another way that they enact violence is that whenever they're called out on their violence, then they cry. They cry, and everyone, including black people, will come to their rescue. And then the blame gets put on us. Then we are agitators. You made her cry. Well, she did something really racist. So what? You made her cry. You made her upset. And so what do? To cope with the stress, to cope with the trauma, we eat, we shop, we self-medicate, we hurt ourselves, we hurt other people. Because we know we can't hurt the people who hurt us. We leave our jobs. We go work in places that don't pay us well, know our worth, but at least we don't have to deal with that everyday violence. And the most about, I mean, I could tell you stories that y'all wouldn't even believe about the type of violence, the things that have gotten, okay, I have to tell you what's one. Because it was just so crazy. There was a all-white office. There was maybe 5 people of color. Of those 5 people, 3 people were black. There was one person that was Latinx and one person that was Asian. They threw a baby shower for one of the white women there. And I've been working there for like a couple of years. They threw a baby shower, and the baby shower was on like a Wednesday or something. I also have a kid too. I was in school. So I didn't go because it was on a Wednesday. And also she was my coworker. I didn't like her. I didn't want to go. I don't want to hang out with you after work. I can be very civil at work, but I don't want to see you after work. So they all went, and I think by that end of the week on Friday, apparently, and I didn't know this, none of the other people of color went either. So I was walking with my supervisor, and we were just talking about whatever, as she's telling me to prove how unracist she is. I refuse to buy my daughter's white Barbie dolls. They only get black Barbies. And I said, why only black Barbies? Well, I just want to make sure that they know that there are other people in this world besides them. It was like, Karen. Anyway, so I have this conversation because she tells me all the time about how she bought a new black Barbie for her daughters. And my coworker who threw the baby shower, we're going to call her Sue. So Sue comes up while we're talking and says, I just have to get this off my chest because it's just bugging me so bad. Amber, you didn't come to the baby shower. And she was accusatory. And it just caught me off guard. And I was like, Sue, what is going on? I had never had any type of confrontation or really a negative interaction with her. And she was like, well, none of you came. And I said, who? She said, well, none of the people of color came, okay? None of the people of color. I opened up my house to you people. I'm quoting her because it was a traumatic experience, and after a while, it got stored in my long-term memory, so I know every single detail. I'm quoting her. She said, I live in River West, and I think it's a pretty diverse neighborhood. I purposefully live there to make sure that I'm around people who don't look like me, and I open up my home to you people, and you don't come. I don't know what it is. She said, are you afraid to be in my neighborhood? I mean, I think it's pretty diverse. There's one black man, I think, that lives in my building. I don't know why you would be uncomfortable. Yeah, I think it's a black man. Yeah, there's a black man that lives in my building. And you didn't come. I blacked out a little bit, because remember the trauma? Mm-hmm. When I came to, I said, Sue, I said, I can tell you why I individually didn't come, but I don't know why the rest of the people of color didn't come. And she was like, well, okay, so the other guy, he's black. She was like, well, I know he grew up in poverty, so that's just middle-class training he doesn't even have to let someone know that he's not gonna show up. He just doesn't have middle-class training. Now, and I said, so is this like the people of color, like the black? She was like, well, so there's one of the people's Asian woman, and I said, well, she's not black, so are you upset with her? Well, she's not black, but she dates black guys, and she kind of talks, and she walks, and I said, so she by default black? Oh, okay. She's Hmong. Oh, okay. And she was just like, I'm really upset. In fact, we're all upset. And then I realized that they were really all upset. So my supervisor, while she's standing there, I said, Karen, are you going to get Sue? And she said, Amber, actually, why didn't you go? You know, you all could have just said something. And I said, do you think we collectively got together and say, hey, are you black? Because I'm black and you're black, and so we're just not going to go. Was that like some resistance move to not attend a baby shower on a Wednesday? I said, it's a Wednesday. I have a school-age child. Who throws a baby shower on a Wednesday? Who does that? It just makes sense that people wouldn't go. And it turned into this really ugly thing where I felt really sick. I threw up because I didn't even realize what was happening. And so I went to go tell our human resources person, who's a black woman, and she said, this is really serious. You need to file a grievance. And I said, no, I don't want any trouble. I was like, I don't want any trouble because I feel like they're gonna come after me. And she said, well, you go home and I'll tell them you left for the day. And I went home and I couldn't go back the next day. I couldn't go back that Monday. I couldn't go back that Tuesday because I felt sick. My head was hurting. My head is hurting actually telling this story now. Wednesday, finally I go back to work and I go talk to the human resources person, and she said, I want to file a complaint on your behalf. And I said, please, why did you do that? I said, they have to investigate and now this is going to be an issue. So now they were contacted by Central Human Resources about what had happened. And so my supervisor came to me and she said, was there something that happened with a baby shower or something? And I said, yeah, it was a racist encounter. And she was like, you know, they didn't really mean it like that. Now Sue's all upset. You gotta go talk to Sue. And I was like, I don't wanna talk to Sue. And she said, actually, no, I'm telling you, you have to go have a meeting, put a meeting on your calendar with Sue. They made me go meet with Sue because Sue was really upset. So I went to meet with Sue in Sue's office. And you know what Sue did? I said to Sue, Sue, I don't know why I'm here meeting with you. I'm the one that's harmed by this. And she said, I just think you just made this too big of a deal. First of all, please don't walk around with a chip on your shoulder. You know, you people always walk around with a chip on your shoulder. I said, are you telling me not to be upset because you just made a racist assumption? And she was like, well, you know, you shouldn't be angry about it. I marched in the 70s. Oh, okay. I said, I burned bras. And I said, feminists can be racist too, okay? There were no black people in the white feminist movement. Oh, okay, and then I said, Sue, you consider yourself to be an intellectual. Well, her husband was a professor, so she liked to call herself a professor by proxy, which is why she also hated me because I was a PhD student and she didn't have a PhD. And I said, Sue, you're an intellectual. I said, explain to me how you made sense of that. That somehow the black people colluded to not attend this baby shower as an act against you. And the Asian woman, explain the Asian woman. She's not black. You thought you just threw her in there with us because she date black men? She had a black boyfriend once? You said she walked a certain way? Black people walk a certain way? I said, explain to me all these things because none of them are logical. You call yourself an intellectual, Sue. And I said, actually, everything you said was anti-intellectual. And here come the tears. Did you call me anti-intellectual? I said, I sure did. And she said, oh my God. And she cried and cried and cried. And you know what I had to do to get out of the meeting? I had to console her. I had to tell her it was okay. I had to tell her I wasn't gonna walk out of here upset. I had to tell her that when I saw her, we were gonna be civil. I had to tell her it was water under the bridge, even though I spent 3 days at home sick because I was so traumatized. I had to console her. I had to tell my supervisor I met with her and she feels better. And my supervisor felt better because Sue felt better. That nobody cared about my health or how I felt. And I've just had repeated experiences like that over and over and over again. And so when I die, I said that. When they take a brain scan, they're gonna see how much trauma's in my brain. Because it changes shape, it has to rewire itself every single time you experience a traumatic experience. Your brain looks different every time. And I said, I wonder what my brain is gonna look like when I die.
Can I just add to that, the traumatic stuff? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So when I hear people talk about trauma, I'm a licensed professional counselor who works with a lot of trauma, and trauma goes through stages, and I'm hearing you talk about each stage of trauma, and it does get stored in the brain. It gets stored in a nonverbal part of the brain, and that part of the brain does not know past, present, and future. It knows present. So every time you go through that experience, you are re-traumatized. Every single time. That original trauma, it could be from 4. That experience happens again over and over and over. And brain scans show that the brain looks smaller than a healthy brain, right? So a traumatized child's brain is going to look a lot smaller than a child who has not had those experiences. And it also looks very similar to those who are in violence. So we look at young men or women in the criminal justice system who are teens. We do brain scans. Their brain looks traumatized. That's what we're looking at. And the brain has to get rid of that trauma. So it's stored, and every time you go through that, you feel that in your body. Your body experiences that. It experiences a startle. It goes through a fight or flight. It goes through a freeze. Then you get into an altered state because you said I had to check out, right? And then you go into automatic obedience. You do what you're told. And then you self-repair. So you eat, you drink, and that's when addictions happen. And what we see in our community is really high rates of addiction, high blood pressure, cancer. All of that is from trauma.
Our oppression and our trauma is
Yeah.
historical.
It is, and it's connected. Absolutely.
Add from way back here in the back, Amber's story. I want everybody in the audience to recognize it's not just Terry's story or Amber's story. That is the experience of most Black folks every day. So if you're here tonight and you think that they're just talking about an experience that they may have had as individual women, that is the experience of most Black people in this nation every day, on a daily basis, several times a day, perhaps, right? If I get a good day, oh my goodness, but rarely. So I don't want you to ever think that you learn this.
Good day. You may not recognize the good day, right? Because there's so much trauma.
It's every day. So please
Right.
don't think it's one woman, 2 women talking about their experiences just a little bit. Most Black people in this nation, every day, more than one time a day.
I wanted to throw out some books, especially when we were talking about white women and fragility and how dangerous it can be. A crucial one is Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. And then we didn't hit any fiction stuff, and there's some like good fiction that speaks to these experiences beautifully. I know we all know The Color Purple, but read it again, especially the scene at the end when the woman who Sophia watched the whole time had her baby and was trying to get Sophia to say, "Isn't my baby beautiful?" And Sophia was like, "Don't give a damn about your baby." Sorry, and it was an accident that we thought that. And also, when we were talking about the emotional trauma, the Ta-Nehisi Coates' new novel is all about the emotional trauma of slavery, and it's beautiful.
I just like to say, hey, Amber, it's Liz. How you doing? So happy to see you. I just want to also talk about just as a protection against the re-traumatization all the time. I'll speak from the I perspective. I tend to seek out Black spaces, and then I also get the pushback. Well, why? You're almost like it's a negative. When you want to create Black spaces, I've had experiences where I've tried to create mom groups and then end up, a Black person invites a white person in there and the mom takes over and it just breaks up the whole Black space. It's like, it's almost like viewed as a threat when you try to be around your people because it's a protection and you need to have a place to heal where you don't have to pretend or you don't have to be anything but your true self. And so that's something that for folks, when you see, it's criminal to see more than 2 or 3 Black people hanging out together, right? Being who we are, what's going on, something has to be going on, but when you see a group of white people together, nobody looks at that as anything untoward. But that's something that I see a lot of my friends or other people that I know seeking that out and needing to be in those spaces and seek out those spaces for extended periods of time and then be able to go back into the majority spaces that we tend to be in most of the time.
9 o'clock.
Okay.
All right.
I'm a punctual Libra, So we are going to wrap this up on time. I thank you all so much for coming and participating. Can we please give our panelists another round of applause? I need to shout out my sponsors. DNS Healing is a sponsor. That was wonderful. The Battery Factory was a sponsor. That was wonderful. Meet at Great Western Farms. And this whole event was put in conjunction with River West Film Fest. So thank you all so much for everything. I think that's all I got.
I want to share a resource with you all. You know, as you were sharing your story, this traumatization that you talked about, I had a similar thing happen to me. I did a TED Talk 3 years ago. You can look it up on YouTube. The title of it is What I Learned from a Lynching Survivor About Anger. And I talk about something that happened to me that traumatized me and literally made me feel like I was a 5-year-old boy. And I relive that like all the time. It's like constantly right there in the front of my mind. It never goes away. And it happened well over a decade ago. Yeah, I'll give you my card so we can connect. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Maddie, are we shut down now? People need to they don't have to go home, but they got to get out of here?